So here's basically what it is, and many of you may know this history already. Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob were co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill Wilson had a little bit more sobriety. He was trying to help others with all different kinds of ways. Having guys stay with him at his house, preaching the gospel to him, and really he was staying sober, and nobody else really was. But then he met Dr. Bob, who was a medical doctor, and the two of them together developed a friendship where they just realized, that we're better off helping one another for our own sake as opposed to trying to treat somebody and evangelizing them into sobriety. It just didn't work. But when they became friends and started living together and started learning what it meant to be responsive in relationship to one another, they stayed sober. They found the common ground in being the co-sufferers together. They also participated in the Oxford Group. Now, the Oxford Group was a Christian evangelical organization developed by a guy named Dr. Frank Buckman. He had worked with the YMCA. He was a missionary overseas. I think it was in China. He was a highbrow thinker and had evangelical meetings at the Ivy League schools, Yale, Princeton, and that area. So quite kind of a highbrow, highly intellectualized organization. This organization found success in helping alcoholics. Now, that wasn't their mission, but alcoholics who got involved in the Oxford Group tended to do better. So that's why Bill W. and Dr. Bob were there, because they were working to stay sober. Now, the tenets of the Oxford Group, and you're going to see this a little bit when we start talking about the 12 steps. Complete deflation of the ego and false pride, dependence on and guidance from a higher power, God. And we're going to talk about higher power, and we're going to talk about God, not just today, but we'll do our step 2. A moral inventory, confession, restitution, and to continue to work with other suffering people. So the Oxford Group, whether this is just what they did, this was part of their path, this was part of their program, and they developed these little house communities that were similar to like our home fellowships, where people would get together and they would talk about implementing these principles into their lives. They would have Bible studies. They would serve one another. That's what the Oxford Group did. Now, there came a point in time where Dr. Buckman went down a social political path that Bill W. and Dr. Bob just couldn't go with him down that path. So they separated from the Oxford Group, and then they began to take those principles from the Oxford Group and really apply it to their community of recovering alcoholics. And that's how we got the 12 steps. Quite an interesting thing. As most of you know, the 12 steps came out in the 30s, and today it has been applied in just about every area of addiction recovery and many different areas of personal bondage and enslavement. And it is a very effective exercise, if you will. So we'll talk about that. Any questions as I move forward on that? Couple of books you might want to read on that. It's on the flip side of your handout there. Comes of Age, the Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age by AA World Services. And one of my favorite books of all time is Courage to Change, The Christian Roots of the 12-Step Movement by Sam Shoemaker. That is one of the foundational books that I'd say it's fair to say that it launched me. With that, I'd like us to go ahead and talk about our 12 steps. What I've done here, as you can see, it looks nothing like your handout. And your handout is actually from some content that I wrote for a behavioral health company. And it's my content, so I cut and pasted it and brought it here tonight. It's actually great content. But this here is a diagram that I kind of came up with at a pinch. A few years ago, I was working at a treatment program, And at 5 minutes before 10, I got a call, sitting in my office, got a call, said, you got to take the 10 o'clock group. Joanna's sick. Now, I tended to get a lot of those calls. And it was like, whatever. And so I walked in, and what I did in this program is I had developed content so that as a patient client would come in, and I worked in the inpatient program, so they would be there 2 to 3, maybe 3.5 weeks. They would never see the same content twice, but it really wasn't that much content because they were rotating in and out all the time. And so just to tell me, hey, you've got to add something else here, I was like, well, I don't have anything else. So I walked in there and had a whiteboard, and as I'm talking to the clients, and I thought we're just going to have a discussion group. One guy who I knew, it had been his 3rd or 4th time in treatment. And he said, I just don't understand the effing 12 steps. And I said, oh, okay. And I had this flashback to when I was new in treatment. It was probably November, December of 99, because I went into treatment in November of 99. And I remember sitting in the treatment room with the 12-step banner on the wall. Anybody know those banners? And I'm looking at that, and it looks like Greek to me. I didn't get it. Not at all. But over the years, in order to survive, and actually it wasn't survival at the beginning, other than I was just trying to stay out of trouble. I'd gotten arrested. Can you believe they would arrest me? I was such a nice guy. Actually, I was a nice guy with a very bad drug problem. Either way, this gentleman made the comment, I just don't get the 12 steps. And you could feel the frustration and the anger in his voice. And I knew that frustration and I knew that anger. And I turned to the whiteboard and I grabbed this thing and I just started writing this out. Almost just like you have it now. And I've given this talk a number of times, so let me help you here. Step number 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our life was unmanageable. That is admitting weakness and need. Anybody excited about admitting weakness and need? Anybody been punished because you've been weak? Anybody been ridiculed when you admitted your need? Yeah, so we don't do that. But if we don't recognize that we're powerless over alcohol or our drugs or the pornography or the gambling, and if we don't understand and come to terms, I like the saying, come to terms with our life is unmanageable, the chaos will continue to overtake us. That's why I put this at the bottom. This is the foundation. When I do this, people go, well, why do you have it backwards? Are you dyslexic? No. This is our starting point. This is ground zero. If you don't do this, none of this will ever make sense. And we'll talk about that. By the way, did you notice the feeling in the room change? Did you notice that when I said things like admitting need and admitting weakness? Boy, I did. It's like the whole energy from you guys changed. I could feel it. Made me sweat. 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. First time I read that, I cringed. My mother spent half of her adult life in mental hospitals. And as a teenager and as a young 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old, I had this horrible fear that I was going to grow up and live in the psych ward. Now, fortunately, I've avoided that one up so far. But the hope step, faith that my future could be better than my past. A power greater than ourselves, could restore us to sanity. We're the weak ones. We're the needy ones. There are a lot of powers greater than we are. Mariner's Recovery Ministry is a power greater than you are. It's a fellowship. The doctor. For me, my first higher power is my lawyer, because he could keep me out of jail. That, by the way, my lawyer is the first person I ever trusted with my life. That's sad to say, but it was. I've learned to trust others since then. Step 3 is we made the decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understood it. It's my decision. What are you going to do? You've admitted your weakness and your need, but you believe in the possibility that your future can be better. So step 3 is, what do you want? That's it. It's not a religious decision. It's not. It's a practical decision. It's a relational decision you make about who you are in relationship to your maker, which affects every other relationship you have in your life. So, when you bring these 3 things together, you've got what I call cognitive reframing. I know my handwriting's really bad. I see your eyes squinting, kind of going, sorry. I did the best I could. Actually, I spent about 40 minutes doing this. Finally, I said, I think that's as good as I'm going to get. But cognitive reframing takes us from this place of hopelessness. Because if we stay here, if this is all we have, there's no reason to stop doing what we're doing. Because, death is not even inevitable. It's here right now, so we might as well feel good while we're dying. Anyone relate with that? I could relate with that. But when I began to see some hope, and for me, I first saw my first hope in 12-step meetings. When I would see people 6-7 months sober, and they were smiling. And they were happy. And I was like, what? All those guys that said they were 10 years sober, I just figured they were lying. But I figured there's no way you could stay sober for 10 years, but teach me how to do what you're doing, because obviously you hadn't gotten caught. So I couldn't imagine staying sober, but I was hoping maybe you could teach me so that I wouldn't get caught. Sound like a good deal? But there was in AA meetings that I began to see that my future could be better than my past. And doggone it, I wanted that. I had never had a sense that my future could be better than today. And when I began to believe that was possible, okay, show me how. Make the decision. And that cognitive reframing began to change everything about my value system. And it began to change the way I viewed the day and the little decisions that I make through the day. By the way, as we move through this, shoot up a hand if you have a question. No comments at this point. But if you have questions, because that's what this is about. I'm not a lecturer. I'm an interactor. So here, this has all happened internally. This is movement in your soul. This has to do with who you are and who you're going to become. And the simple question is, what do you want? We go steps 4 through 9 and things change. We call these the action steps. I know most of you probably heard them, the action steps. We made it step 4. We made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. It's honesty with ourselves. This is a commitment to reality. Do you know the baseline of mental health is a commitment, a personal commitment to reality? When we start making commitments to fantasy, we start leading ourselves into insanity. Now, we all kind of tiptoe around that a little bit. I more than most, I'm sure. But a commitment to the reality, that's the baseline of mental health. This is an exercise that basically to help you take your life and you put it down on paper. And you know what? There's no judgments to be made here. This is not about keeping score. This is not about pass or fail. This is just writing the shit down. Thank you, Jack, for opening up the door for me. I feel much better. You can bleep that later. When you talk about character defects, I'll share with you my little issue that I have with my verbiage. A searching and fearless moral inventory is just that. It's searching and fearless. It's not because you were a bad man or a bad woman. And it ain't even because you're so great. It's just, this is your life. It's about things that you've done. It's about things that others have done to you. You just write it down. That's it. When you write it down, you can deal with it. You ever remember something from your past? Maybe something you did, or something someone did to you, and you found yourself go like that? Kind of catch your breath. Your heart skipped a beat. You feel a little tension in your neck all of a sudden. Oh, great. I'm the only one. Well, that's something you need to write down. Because whatever it was that caused that reaction, you write that down. Now you can deal with it. You got it. Right there. Step 5. We admitted to God, to ourselves, and another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Honesty with others. By the way, we're drawing a pattern here. Step 5 has a huge relational pattern. It talks about honesty with God, honesty with ourselves, and honesty with another person. This is the framework for a healthy human being, to be in relationship, an honest relationship with God and with ourselves and other human beings. It doesn't mean the whole world has to know all your stuff. Not at all. That's why our meetings are private. That's why they're confidential. But somebody needs to know about that thing that makes you go, oh. Somebody needs to know about that. Because that way you're not stuck alone with it. So, honesty with myself. Step 4, honesty with God and others. This is relational honesty. That's step 5. Step 6, we became entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Now, these defects of character, we just talked about like, well, wait a minute, where'd they come from? They're going to show up in your step 4 inventory. They're there. And you know what? You won't be surprised by them because you know what they are. But because now they're on paper, you can deal with them. Before, they just haunt you. And those are the things that you find yourself going, my gosh, why did I do that again? Why did I do that again? 80%, I'm sure it's actually more than that, I think it's 90% of our thinking, 90% of our behavior, 90% of our mental processing is driven by things that are not at the conscious level. Subconscious. Things that are kind of below the surface of our awareness. When we start writing things out, and then we see what's there, and we go and we talk it over with God, and we talk it over with another human being, this exercise creates this amazing paradigm of empathy that is proven to heal a traumatized brain. Trauma in life, whether it was done to you or you've done it to yourself, and by the way, that's what our addictions are. Addictions are self-trauma, but they feel so good, but they are self-trauma. We are at the neurochemical level creating brain damage. Not the kind of brain damage that shows up on the outside, but it shows up in our mood, shows up in our emotional processing, it shows up in our decision making. It shows up in the little things like how we eat and how we get along with others, how we feel about ourselves when we see ourselves in the mirror. Well, the experience of being spoken, of speaking our truth to God and to others, having them hear it, and having them give us an embrace, acceptance. That's a very healing thing. And I think of it like this. In step 6, we have a desire to become a different kind of human being. I've come to terms with the fact that I'm an alcoholic and a drug addict. I don't have any problem with it. But I don't live like one much anymore. But I remember it because that diagnostic understanding is essential to remind me of what my limits are, to remind me what my vulnerabilities are. But whereas before I would think of myself as like doomed to always be this way. And so I quit hoping. Step 6, a desire for health and wholeness, really is a byproduct of this hope. Not only can my future be different, but I can be different. You can become a different kind of human being. And that is what step 7 is about. We appeal and trust God in the healing process. We humbly ask God to remove all these defects of character. Why do we ask Him to do it? Because we can't. We've already admitted that our life is unmanageable. And that listen, I'm powerless over alcohol and drugs. I'm absolutely hopeless when it comes to me curing my character defects. I can change my behaviors, but I can't always change my character defects. But God can. Because He's the one that transforms. We provide the willingness. We put one foot in front of the other, and He brings change. Now, there's one part of this trusting God in the healing process that I find rather irritating and quite inconvenient. And the fact that now God is in control of this. And I would really like to go to God and say, look, God, here's my identified list of 5 character defects. Because I'm only sure of 4, but I really stretched it. I think maybe I might have 5. And I've put them in order. So if you would just go through and first of all, help me get in control of my spending life because I need more money because I want more stuff. And get me in control of my saying the bad words because that embarrasses me and it irritates other people. And see, I just want God to cure me according to my agenda. And it has never happened. Ever. But I have found God do things for me that were never on my radar screen. I've written 3 books. I don't know how many articles. I've developed content for treatment programs. And before I got sober, I had never read a book. Ever. Why would I read a book? There was television. And there was Sports Illustrated. And if you needed something intellectual, there was Playboy. So why would I read a book? First book I ever read was the big book from Alcoholics Anonymous. And I read it because they told me to read this book, and if you don't read it, you're going to jail. Okay, fine. So I read the book. My life has improved much more because God was in charge of the process than when I've been in charge of the process. I can't see that. How am I doing on time? I got 10 more minutes. 10 minutes. Okay. I'm doing good. Step 8. We made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. This has to do with awareness of our relational responsibility. Can you imagine? I couldn't figure out a list of people I'd harmed. Who would that be? I didn't even have a clue. I'm 18 years sober, and the list continues to grow because of awareness. Nothing changes without awareness, ever. It's awareness that allows us to admit that we've got a problem with alcohol or drugs. It's awareness that helps us realize that maybe our future could be better than our past. It's awareness that helps us to go, oh my gosh, I had no idea. Probably the number one person on your amends list should be yourself. Many of you have probably heard that before. And that's always a great place to start. And you know what? It's just about making a list and being willing and just being aware. By the way, You'll get help from that step 4, and those other things, again, that you would think about, not just things that happened that made you go, huh? But when you thought about a person, and you want to go, oh, or you want to go kill them. Not that I ever was angry about anything, ever. Awareness. 9, being relationally responsible. We made direct amends wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So whenever it's possible, you go make direct contact with these people and you see what you can do to make things right. Now, if they want you to go lasso the moon, I don't think anybody's going to be lassoing the moon. It makes for a pretty song and a nice movie, but it's not what we do. And you might encounter some people that will make demands of you and expect you to do things that you just can't do. So maybe you'll have to put the amends off to a later time. Or maybe you'll just have to trust God to make it possible. This is about doing what you can with what you've got. It's not about selling yourself into slavery. And it's not about crawling into this bed of overwhelming guilt and shame. It's just a practical making amends. And if you can do that with 1 or 2 people in your life, great. Don't worry about the other 10 or 20. And start with yourself by making a living amends, by just being good with yourself today. Now, we do all of these things. These are called the action steps, and I call them relational transformation. You can see why. It has everything to do with the relationship with yourself and your relationship with God and your relationship with other people. This is the nuts and bolts of your relational healthy life, whether you're an alcoholic or not. Many of these things here we would naturally do if we didn't have a problem with drugs and alcohol. As we learn to find freedom from the effects of drugs and alcohol, we find that these things begin to be quite natural. Not always easy, but you can do them. Steps 10, 11, and 12, people often call them as the maintenance steps. That's how they were explained to me early on, and we'll see why. Many of you know why, but if you haven't, we'll talk about that. I don't think of anything in recovery as maintenance. When I go into maintenance mode, that's when I start doing things like eating a box of chocolate, which is one step away from having, a 6-pack of diet soda, which is one step away from having a cigarette. And by the way, cigarettes were the hardest thing. It took me 7 years to quit. Yeah, it's like, oh my gosh. Either way. I call these steps ongoing growth. Step 10, we continue to take inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Now, step 10 is nothing that's new. We're doing this. All this is, but by the time you've done this, and you start to exercise these things, you're going to have, guess what? Expanded awareness. More insight. You'll be a little more enlightened, is a nice little kind of spiritual guru term, which I'm not into gurus, but it makes sense. So this is just continuing what we're doing, and instead of it being a once and for all deal, this becomes just part of what we do. We do it on a daily basis. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that to you. I was thinking about a guy in Starbucks the other day. I went Starbucks. It was like Sunday morning at 5:30 in the morning. Got my coffee and my newspaper, and I was putting the stuff in my coffee. And I turned around, some guy sitting there reading my newspaper before I had my coffee. And I said, "Excuse me, sir, that's my paper." And he looks at me and he goes, "I'm just reading the effing headlines." And then he turns his back to me. It's a miracle I'm here today. It is a miracle. I'm not, you know what? Everything smoothed out, thankfully. I guzzled that coffee. It was like, gave it 30 seconds and said, okay. 18 years ago, I would have been duking it out with that guy. 11. Sought. S-O-U-G-H-T. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for the knowledge of His will and the power to carry that out. Do you hear the surrender in that? Do you hear the journey in that? Let me encourage you to think about home as bigger and better than what you can even imagine. Home is in the bosom of your Maker. I don't know how to draw that picture for you. I know that He showed up in the flesh. And the people who loved Him were the lepers. And were the harlots. And the blind people. People I relate to. And that's the God that I love. And I seek Him. And as I journey, He kindly and gently leads me the next step with an invitation and encouragement. And when necessary, He can use a little bit of the carrot and the stick thing, which quite honestly I find pain continues to be a strong motivator for me. But this has to do with spiritual disciplines. In the Christian community, there's a lot of talk what we call about spiritual formation. Spiritual formation is taking ancient Christian disciplines like meditation, silence, solitude. I work with an organization called the Leadership Institute. It's a spiritual formation organization. People come from all over the world to go to these seminars. And they teach pastors and Christian workers and ministers and missionaries about time and silence and time and solitude. And there's huge fascination amongst these people about what we recovering addicts do. Because we learn in our 12 steps to do these things. When you get your journal and you start journaling, that is a spiritual discipline. Every word that you write is prayer and communication. And it's the secret place where you and God connect. Do this. Do this. Step 12 is having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. We try to carry the message to those that still suffer and to practice these principles in all our affairs. This has to do with a spiritual awakening. This is nothing you have to do. It's already happened. This is the payoff. This is the value of your weakness and your need applied in these areas. And the great result is for you a spiritual awakening that you will be overwhelmingly generous with. You won't be able to contain yourself. You will naturally and intuitively tell people about, you know what? I'm a recovering alcoholic. And I discovered that God loves me. That changed everything.